Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to moderate this session of the ERF webinar series, which is part of the ERF 27th Annual Conference. This session deals with wages and inequality in Egypt. We have two papers, and the usual format of ERF will be followed. So each presenter will present the paper in 10 minutes. Then I give my comments as the moderator. And then the presenters, if they wish, they can come back and respond. And then we have opened the floor for discussions. So the first paper is by Bjorn Nielsen. I give a brief introduction to each presenter before they present their papers. This would be a brief introduction, so if you want more elaborate biography, please look at the ERF website, it's more there. Now, Bjorn is assistant professor at the University of Paris-Saclay. He holds a PhD from University of Paris-Dauphine. He says that he is a development economist at heart, which is great to hear, and his research interests involve issues related to migration, labor markets, and household resource management. He has been consultant for a variety of international organizations such as World Bank, ILO, UNDP, AFD, and FAO. So without further ado, I invite Bjorn to start his presentation.
Thank you very much. So I'll just go and share my PDF. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have only 10 minutes, so I will try to be as fast as possible. This paper is ongoing research about labor unions in Egypt and the famous union wage gap that's been a familiar topic in economics for many decades. But interest is kind of been fading, and that's a shame because we don't know enough about union wage effects, especially in developing countries. There's a very well documented literature from mainly Europe and North America, especially from English-speaking countries. There's a little bit of literature from South America and a little bit from Africa, but there's almost nothing from the MENA region. So one of the motivations for this paper is precisely that. Another motivation is that we don't know how labor unions operate under, let's say, semi-authoritarian regimes, countries where one leader has been at power for several decades, which has been the case in Egypt for most of the time since independence. Egypt is also an interesting case in point from a union perspective because it's quite regularly being pointed fingers at as a country where labor rights are not particularly well respected. Okay, so those are two motivations. So the questions are very straightforward. The first one is there a positive union wage gap in Egypt? And I'll tell you what I find using the data that's available. I do find that is the case. There is a positive union wage gap, which holds under several different specifications. So if you're in a unionized job, you earn more than if you're not in a unionized job. I tried to look at this a little bit over time as well, using several rounds of the ELMPS. It seems that this wage gap has been slightly reduced over time. And finally, perhaps the most interesting question that I want to ask is this wage gap the result of union bargaining power? In other words, what we think is behind the union wage gap in most of the literature is union bargaining power, rent extraction from firms. Is this the case in Egypt? And I will argue that I think it's not. Okay, so very quickly, perhaps a few words about the union landscape in Egypt. So unions have been a feature of Egypt for a long time. They grew a lot following independence, and were united under the umbrella organization ETUF, the Egyptian Trade Union Federation, and created by Nasser in 1957, which until fairly recently was the sole legal entity that was supposed to be representative of Egyptian workers. But some authors, mainly political scientists and sociologists, have criticized the Egyptian Trade Union Federation as an extension of the state, okay, and with a very vertical way of proceeding, very vertical organization. One example of that is the fact that if workers want to go on a strike, according to the trade union law from the 1970s, a strike must be approved by 2/3 of the executive committee at the national level sector union. So that would be if restaurant workers in one small city want to go on a strike, they would need the approval from the national committee, which, according to many of these authors, contained members from the government or their representatives. So there's also this discussion about the independence, the actual independence of unions in Egypt. This changed a little bit since the 1980s. There was a rise in collective actions, especially after the year 2000, and today there are two new umbrella organizations in parallel to the ETUF, which claim to represent some 3 million Egyptian workers. So I can say more about that if you want later, but to move on, I'll go a bit quicker. So the ELNPS is my main data source. I'm guessing that those who listen may be a bit familiar with it, so I'm not going to go back into that. It has the good feature of having at least one question on union membership. That's the case for the annual labor force surveys by the CAPMAS and the ERF as well. But in the public available data, that question is censored, so I wasn't able to use it. So I'll use the ELNPS and also the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. So looking at the ELNPS, this is at 4 points in time what the proportion of unionized workers looks at by sector and by employment status. So by all accounts, it has been going down, although differently so in different sectors, but the overall trend is the same across sectors and also across employment statuses. It's worthy to note that the most or the highest rates of unionization occur in the government sector, followed by public enterprises, and then the formal private sectors. And of course, irregular wage workers and informal private sector workers don't unionize. So to go back into the theory behind unions, although I probably don't have enough time, just in one sentence, unions can only exist if their firms have rents. Okay, so the existence of unions implies that markets aren't complete, markets aren't perfect, competition is not perfect, and that's of course why unions manage to extract rents from firms which continue surviving anyway. So this perhaps I can skip quickly. What I wanted to say, the most important thing here is that the study, the evidence that we have from developing countries points to a lower union wage gap than in developing countries. And in some cases, there's been reports of negative union wage gaps, meaning that unionized workers earn, corrected by education, etc., lower wages than non-unionized workers. And according to Richard Freeman, who put together this summary, this doesn't really make sense and suggests that these unions are presumably not normal unions doing collective bargaining. On the side of measurement, and I think this is one of the reasons that the literature on unions isn't that well endowed these days as it was a couple of decades ago. There's a lot of endogeneity issues and a lot of measurements problems when you try to identify a union effect on wages or on anything else. Unions, of course, aren't exogenously formed. They appear in sectors where work conditions are bad, which creates a downward bias on the union wage gap. That's at the union level. At the individual level, there is also selection. Lower skilled or lower abled individuals would tend to benefit more from joining union jobs. So that would also create downward bias on the skill premium. And there can be selection on the employer side as well. If there are queues to union jobs, for example, then employers may have the possibility to select workers. And they would, of course, would be in their interest to select the most productive workers, and this would put an upward bias on this premium. There are some spillover effects as well, which make it a bit difficult to identify a pure union effect on one enterprise, on one company. I'll perhaps come back to those later. I don't know if I have a lot of time. Let's say that all of these difficulties have led some authors to conclude that actually a simple OLS might be the best specification to look at the union wage gap. It has the advantage of being very, very simple to put in place. And although we know that it's biased, it's very commonly reported. So for comparability, it's good. So let me show you a simple OLS done on union membership on wages as the outcome here. And there's one regression done for each round of the ELMPS. So in addition to these control variables here, there are occupation, economic activity, governorate, employment status, and other dummies present. As we can see, the union wage gap is positive, significant. It increases a lot from 98 to 2006, then decreases a little bit. What we can say is that it's increased since 2018, or it's decreased since 2006 by using the confidence intervals from the estimates. Okay, but this could be explained either by a true union effect or by the different different selection procedures that I briefly discussed before. So one way of trying to see whether individual selection is a big factor of explanation for these results is to do the same estimates in a panel specification using individual fixed effects. So that's what I do next. I split the data into two wave pairs. So 98 will go with 2006, 2006 will go with 2012, and etc. And I use the population aged 18 to 55 in the first wave of each pair. Doing that, I get different results, qualitatively similar results, but much lower. Now the coefficient is down to around 5%. So this is a semi-log specification, meaning that being a union member increases your wage by 7, 5, or 6%.
Bjorn, could you please sum up in 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I then use propensity score matching as well, but I won't show you that because I don't have time. So I'll just try to move on a bit. The last wave of the ELMPS allows us to know whether or not individuals who are not union members have colleagues who are. So we can compare the effect on individuals who are actual member with the effect on those who are only working at a place where others are union members. And doing that makes the coefficient much less robust. And when we include institutional sector dummies in particular, there is no longer a significant and positive coefficient. This would mean that it's being a union member oneself rather than being at a workplace where there's a union presence that matters. Okay, so this questions a little bit the effect behind the initial wage gap estimates. So to go a bit further, this is what I do with the second and final part of the paper, is that I want to look at the wage distribution effects of unionization and also perhaps effects on profits. So to sum up, I won't go through this literature here. I'll just say that we know that unions tend to compress the wage distribution, okay, and decrease profits, which is precisely what they seek out to do. They want to capture rents from firms, and that's what the literature finds. So let me show you here at the sectoral level some effects of union coverage on the Gini index, okay, for the same ELMPS data. To give you a summary, I don't find anything. Usually we would like to see a negative effect and negative and significant effect of the union dummy here, the union percentage actually, it's positive and not significant. So there's no evidence that increased unionization in a sector leads to wage compression. Okay, and what about profits? This would maybe my last table. Here I use the World Bank Enterprise Survey, looking at how the union rate correlates with the company's profits. I use either the union rate or a dummy for some union presence. So if unions worked as they traditionally are supposed to, then they would decrease profits on the literature. Here, the unionization rate is actually positively correlated with profits in one specification and very close to zero in another one. So these two last tables suggest to me that unions do not engage in proper wage bargaining in Egypt. And there's a bit of a puzzle there that's interesting, because still in several specifications, we do find that jobs, unionized jobs are better paid. So I guess this is the starting point for the ensuing discussion, perhaps. What can explain this puzzle? In my opinion, in Egypt, unions do not engage in proper wage bargaining, but unionized jobs are better jobs than non-unionized jobs.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. I
will hold it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's an extensive paper, and the paper is available to the participants, but hopefully everyone would have looked at it. But thank you for presenting it in a concise way. Now we move on to the next paper, which
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. Is by May Gadala and Rania Roshdi. May is an associate professor at Cairo University Faculty of Economics and Political Science, and currently the statistics manager at the ERF. She holds a PhD in biostatistics from University of California, Los Angeles, and a master's degree from statistics from Cairo University. She has been a consultant for a number of international and national organizations such as World Bank, UNFA, ERF, Population Council, Middle East, the USAID. Her research interests are in the areas of labor market, education, gender studies, impact evaluation, nutrition, and other topics focused on poverty and youth-related policies. The co-author of this paper is Rania Roshdi. Rania is an associate professor at the Department of Economics School of Business, the American University in Cairo. Before joining AUC, she worked as at the Population Council Egypt office. She holds a PhD and an MA in economics from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, as well as MSc and BSc in statistics from Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University. Her research interests are household economics, economic vulnerability and exposure to shocks, program evaluation, youth school to work transition, and labor market dynamics, gender roles, and urban poverty and inequality. So may I invite May and Rania to present their paper in 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. Thank you to the ERF for accepting this in the conference. And the paper's title is Wage Inequality Among Vocational Secondary Graduates in Formal and Informal Urban Areas of Egypt. And this work was supported by a research grant that was given from the Social Research Center at Cairo University and was funded by the GIZ. Oh, here. I'm sorry. Okay. Let me first give a background regarding the vocational education in Egypt and the labor market status in Egypt as well. Over the last few decades, actually, the Egyptian labor market has been suffering from several challenges, and these challenges were exaggerated by the political changes that happened after the 2011 Egyptian revolution. These problems actually are particularly more obvious among the vocational education graduates. The vocational education graduates actually constitute about 2/5 of the young people in the age category 18 to 29 years. And each year, actually, around 50% of those who graduate from preparatory schools are channeled to vocational secondary education. So they enter the vocational secondary education, and nearly 500,000 every year graduates from the vocational education. So this is the reason it's important to study the vocational educational graduates. On the other hand, actually, the quality of education system in general and that of vocational secondary education has been persistent concern over the past few years and over the years. Daughtry in 2014 demonstrated that vocational secondary graduates experience prolonged unemployment spells before they transit to their first job. Right now, actually, the periods of unemployment tends to be shorter than they observed among university graduates. And the reason for that, actually, that they start their job, their participation in the job market with an informal employment and low quality jobs. Esfahani in 2009 found that the cumulative returns to completing vocational secondary education for men aged between 20 and 54 who are living in urban areas as compared to those didn't complete any level of education were just 30%. That was done in 2000, based on data in 2006 in Egypt. A current one that was done by Karen Kraft demonstrated that such returns to vocational secondary education have declined and reached almost zero in recent years. This is one part. On the other hand, when we look at the vocational graduates, we see that several recent studies highlighted how young people living in informal areas experience different forms of marginalization on the labor market due to their place of residence. Those who actually live in informal areas, they have been marginalized in the last few years. The studies showed that in the last few years. This is the reason that motivated us to study this, since few research has focused on investigating how the large group of young graduates of the vocational education system fare on the job market, and none focused actually on those who are living in the informal urban areas. I need to clarify something here that by informal areas we mean the informal areas in urban. We don't have informal areas in rural. So actually the informal areas, are sometimes called the slums, are only present in urban areas and not in rural areas. The main objective of this paper is to contribute to filling this gap in the empirical literature by examining the returns to education among vocational secondary graduates residing in informal urban areas as compared to their formal urban and rural peers in Egypt. So we are going to compare between the three areas: informal, urban, and rural. The data that we are using is the survey of young people in Egypt, 2014. It was a national representative panel of young people who were surveyed in 2009. The regional one was around 15,000 young people. In 2014, they were followed up, and the survey managed to reach 73% of them. and they were re-interviewed. We are focusing in this paper on young people aged between 15 and 35 who are no longer in school during the SARP interview. The sample size is around 3,200. We are focusing on wage workers since we're analyzing the return to education and wages. And are actually around 875 were living in urban areas, around 1,400 living in rural areas, and around 200 were living in urban areas across Egypt. We used trimmed distribution, so the highest 1% of wage distribution was excluded from this sample. First, before we go to the analysis, let's have an overview of youth education attainment here in Egypt, comparing the three areas and comparing between males and females. Generally, as you see here, around 2/5, or more actually than 2/5 of the males have a vocational secondary degree, while among females, 2/5 actually are below secondary degree. So I need to mention here that we have three groups of education degrees, below secondary and general secondary are together, vocational and above secondary. So actually above secondary includes both, have 2 years above secondary and university degree as well. As you see, the below secondary education is more prevalent among young women, as you might see here, while actually the vocational is more prevalent among males in both informal areas and rural areas. When it comes to the jobs that they having right now, it's the vocational secondary graduates are more likely to end in informal jobs, whether it's regular or irregular. As you see here, among male, we have like around 2/3 of the male in the vocational who have vocational degree have actually informal job, whether it's regular or irregular. Among women, it's only 1/3 of those who have a vocational degree and are working end up in informal job, whether it's regular or irregular. When we see this compared to the above secondary, working in the government and public, working in the government is more likely to be found among those who are in above secondary.
May, could you please sum up in 3 minutes, maybe maximum or less?
Okay. So in order to study the return to education, we use the Mentor equation. It's made using both ordinary least square and unconditional quantile regression as defined by Ferpo, the RIF regression. Let me show you the results directly. These are the results for the ordinary least square estimates. And as you see here, if we use it, there is no return to vocational education compared to below secondary at all in all regions, urban, rural, to informal areas. While for those who are above secondary, there is only return to this educational level in urban and rural, while in informal areas, there is no return to education at all. At the same time, when we look at the gender gap, we'll see that there is a gender gap in urban and informal areas, while there's no gender gap in rural areas. This is using the ordinary least square. Using the unconditional quantile regression, estimates returns to education, we'll see some differences. In vocational education, there is return to vocational education in the first quartile and the median, while there's no return at the third quartile. This is in urban and rural. While in informal areas, there is no return at all, whether among those who graduated from vocational schools or those who have higher degree. Above secondary, they have returned to, there's a positive return to education all over the distribution, the first quartile, median, and the third quartile. When we're looking at the female, we'll see that there is a gender gap all over the distribution in urban, while in rural and informal, there's only a gender gap at the lowest quartile of the wage distribution. This actually summarizes what we have, and as you see in informal areas, the return to education is below the urban and rural in all over the distribution. In vocational and actually in higher distribution and higher education as well. This is below urban and rural, and here's as well, it's below urban and rural. So the main results, there is a large dispersion or inequality in return to education across the quantile of wages among individuals in the same educational group. This is clear from here. As you see, there is variation in the coefficients. Vocational education seems to pay off as compared to lower education level only in the low and the middle quantile, but not in the third quantile of the wage distribution. The low and middle quantile, where the high skills actually are not generally required. Education in general doesn't seem to significantly pay in informal areas. The return to vocational education is higher in urban areas. And there exists a large wage inequality against females, particularly in urban areas of Egypt. The policies and the recommendation here. While the Egyptian labor market suffers from several challenges, young people actually residing in informal areas are the most vulnerable group, particularly those with vocational secondary education degree. In order to reform the vocational education, there were several initiatives, but there was no unified strategy from the different sides who started the initiatives. Accordingly, given the long list of failed attempts to reform vocational secondary education, it's now an appropriate time actually for the government to consider organizing all these efforts under the same under one umbrella. Continuous communication should exist between the demand side and the labor market, employers and business owners, and the Ministry of Education. New curricula should be developed, and right now there are new curriculum in renewable energy and logistics, and they started implement these in some of the schools all over Egypt.
Well, thank you, Rania. May, sorry, if you want to conclude.
Shall I continue?
No, conclude.
Yeah, and these are the policies in general. There's an urgent need to design employment programs that target specifically to the interests and needs of different groups of young people living in informal areas in Egypt, and particularly those who graduated from vocational schools. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we move straight to the discussions. Let me upload my oh yeah. Okay. Let me. Okay, I'll start with the comments on Bjorn's paper, which is about, the title is, Do Egyptian Labor Unions Have Bargaining Power? I think it's an important topic on wage setting institutions in Egypt. The first generation of work on wages in Egypt and other MENA countries has been concerned with issues such as returns to education and different types of wage discrimination. This paper can be the start of an attempt at understanding the role of wage setting institutions. How are the wages negotiated between the employers and workers in different segments of the labor market? And in particular, what is the role of the highly centralized trade unions in this process? So what is the role of centralized trade unions in authoritarian regimes? I think Bjorn raises this question, but it may need more discussion. This needs to be discussed in more detail at the outset. The paper provides anecdotal quotes in various sections of the paper that, for example, that ETUF is either defined or that it serves only the interests of the employers. I think if you look at the role of these centralized trade unions in authoritarian regimes, actually the role may be even more important than in democratic regimes and free trade unions in democratic regimes. The authoritarian state knows how to deal with the crowds through coercion, subsidies, etc. But dealing with labor in the formal or corporate sector, particularly of the economy, where workers can potentially organize and cripple the economy, is a much more delicate matter. The centralized trade unions within the authoritarian regimes need to deal with such delicate matters. As such, they play an important role, particularly as wage-setting institutions and in terms of other cooptation methods. I mean, here we are not discussing whether this is an optimal way of dealing with labor. Of course, it has a lot of problems, but the question is how did these unions act actually? This needs to be better theorized in terms of labor management, in terms of as a system of labor management. And for the purposes of this paper, as a wage setting mechanism, taking into account the interests of workers, employers, and the state. Questions to be posed, these are questions to be posed up front. Well, as a first attempt in investigating the role of trade unions in wage determination in Egypt, it would have been useful to discuss the organizational structure and the functioning of trade unions and the nature of negotiated wage settlements. What role is stipulated for trade unions in the labor law? What type of labor contracts the law recognizes, and how does it affect the implementation of central wage settlements for different labor market segments? For example, private, public, formal, informal. Now, formal and informal, both contractual, as the paper has paid attention to it, but also in terms of sectoral informality. And this again goes back to what parts of the enterprise sector is required to belong to unions. There are lots of questions that need to be posed. Such information can help in modeling wage gap and other issues discussed in the paper in perhaps a more informed way. The rich ELMPS data can in turn be used to shed light on some of these questions. I mean, it's really valuable to have this data. I'm not going to go through the discussion of the data, but each time I read or review a paper on Egypt, I realize how rich this data is and how really valuable is this cooperation between researchers and data gathering agencies in producing such rich data. Okay, I go through each section of the paper as it's presented by Bjorn. First is the question identification issues. Well, Bjorn discusses non-random selection of unionized worker issues in detail. Some of these are relevant where independent, more relevant maybe, where independent trade unions exist with voluntary membership. So the better understanding of the role of trade unions in Egypt can really help here in terms of course, there are issues related to heterogeneity bias here, but they may more be related to labor market segmentation rather than selectivity bias. I mean, this is something we can discuss in more detail maybe later. So the question of OLS result, union wage gap. So OLS result on union wage gap. Well, it's very important to really provide summary statistics on all of the included variables. This is missing in this paper, and I think, you know, for a reader and especially for a discussion, it's very important to have that information. I mean, it's not good practice to just provide your estimates and then, of course, Bjorn is very careful in terms of critical understanding of these results, but still, it would be useful to have these summary statistics. Now, I think in terms of heterogeneity rather than self-selection is more important in the context of Egypt. If, for example, both the public and private sector enterprises at some level are required to be part of the ETUF, so selection is not really the issue. The issue would be really labor market segmentation. For example, in the equation, maybe the size of the firm, in addition to the contract, the type of contract needs to be included. Well, there are some peculiarities. For example, age is insignificant. Maybe you want to introduce experience and experience squares, which most of the earnings equation in Egypt find significant. So, and this data is through retrospective sort of questionnaires are provided in the ELMPS maybe. Okay, I'll just move on. I mean, it's true that because of all these biases, we need to be careful, and then we move on to the panel study results. Again, here, descriptive statistics on what variables are necessary. You have to look more carefully into sample attrition issues. I mean, you give reference to works by Ragi, who says, well, this is a representative survey, but still it may be informative about the question that you are trying to answer. So you need identification of individuals in household panel. If it's a household panel representative of the household, then what happens in terms of individuals, particularly the young individuals. Then there is the assumption of symmetry of union separation effects. Whether you leave the union or join the union, the effect is similar. As you know, the attenuation errors because of the measurement errors are important. And I wish you had the summary statistics so we could discuss these perhaps in more informed way. One peculiarity that I noticed in this is that the number of observations in the panel regressions are larger than the sum of the two cross sections that are used. So somehow it's odd, which I don't know what's going on. Then the next section, you discuss the union effect. Is it personal? Again, summary statistics for our variables are missing. And the result that you find, you discuss in terms of, yeah, this may be linked to the type of contractual agreements. So there are these workers in enterprises which are unionized, but since they have informal contracts, they don't benefit from that. But that's really the beginning of the question. With the rich data set that you have, I think it's very important to pursue this issue and see how it pans out. So then you provide propensity score matching results. Again, it's not indicated what variables are used in estimated propensity scores. Again, we need summary statistic in terms of the matched and overall sample. Would, for example, matching by enterprise size preserve these results? And may I point out here that actually in the type of sort of labor market institutions we have in Egypt, these centralized ones, the absence of a wage gap actually may be more important indicator of the power of these trade unions. Because if you do the matching by including the enterprise size and kind of labor market segmentation. So, you know, these are important issues to be addressed. Then you move on to income distribution, concentration of income. I think you need better methodologies to discuss this, particularly distinguishing between the between and within effects. My hunch is that the centralized unions in Egypt actually worsen income distribution in lower parts of the distribution because of this labor market segmentation. But of course, they condense distribution in the upper parts, and that may be the reason you get you know, insignificant results. But maybe using some of the methods used in the second paper in terms of you know, identify the effect on quantiles would be a better methodology to answer this question. And then you move on to the World Bank Enterprise Survey results. You know, you assume that again that the existence of unions should lead to lower profit share. I don't see the reason for this. Actually, in the type of centralized unions that you have in Egypt, if they are effective, they squeeze profits more, because you know, if all enterprises, despite whether they have rents or not, are required to be part of that and part of the centralized wage agreements, actually you will find the results that you find would be more sensible in terms of profit shares in unionized sectors, maybe higher. I mean, they preserve the rents because you know, these centralized agreements do not take into account the rents. So to sum up, I think it's an interesting start, but you covered too many issues in the paper. Maybe if you focus on particular issues and start with the theorizing, you know, what is the role of these trade unions in Egypt? I don't know. I'm just from what I gather and from what I can guess about the function of these unions in authoritarian regimes, I'm making some suggestions, but the point is we need better understanding of this. And then each of these issues that you cover are very important and maybe need more attention. Okay, now I move to comments on the paper by Gadalla and Rushdie. The title of the paper is Wage Inequality Among Vocational Secondary Graduates in Formal and Informal Urban Areas in Egypt. Well, the title of the paper indicates wage inequality among vocational school graduates, but the paper looks at the impact of vocational education, vocational trading on wage inequality in general. So maybe, you know, title should basically be a bit amended. Then they use RIF or recentered influence function regression methods to investigate the impact of variables, various factors, including vocational education, on inequality or unconditional inequality. Well, if that is the case, actually you're interested in inequality, it would be appropriate to start with an overview of the nature of earnings inequality and its change over time. And then you can use these methods to see what factors explain that. The paper uses cross-section data for 2014 survey of young people, and then its second round in 2000 and first round 2009 and second round in 2014. The study is conducted over separate samples from urban, rural, and informal urban areas but it does not explain or define what is informal urban areas and the reasons for its being separately investigated from the urban population. I think this needs to be explained further. 3 educational categories are distinguished: below secondary, vocational secondary, and higher education. Since secondary education sample is small, they have integrated that sample with below secondary education. It may be more appropriate to drop them on the whole rather than integrating them with the below secondary. But the question that it arises is why such secondary school sample is small. It may indicate that these people with secondary education either drop out of the labor market, maybe in the case of women, but maybe they move on to higher education. So higher education is not necessarily university education if they are, sorry, I have to close this door because it's a bit so higher education may maybe, you know, extension of sort of vocational training, maybe 1 year or 2 year training, and then I think it would be therefore to distinguish this. It would be useful to disaggregate your higher education into more disaggregated categories. Again, summary statistics are necessary for both the OLS and the RIF regression results. Is not provided. I mean, it's not good practice to just provide your results and discuss them. I mean, really, I mean, it's not just a summary statistic, but one should really criticize to the extent possible the regression results. And at the end, what remains, then we can make some conclusions about them. The informal urban sample is too small. Maybe should be dropped or combined with urban, total urban, and probably use some, I don't know, dummy variables. If you want to separate something, I think it's better to separate male and female. I know that female workers, the probably sample is too small, but then focus on male because, you know, women work in occupationally specific jobs, and they, you know, you lose support in the type of studies that you do. So it's better to just focus on male, I think. Now, unconditional quantile results in table 2. Well, the standard deviations need to take into account the variance of the quantile influence functions that you estimate. So you need to do bootstrapping techniques. You cannot just look at your RIF regression results, because in order to do that, you have to perform a prior estimation of these influence functions, and that affects your variance. The issue of confoundedness for both OLS and RIF regressions, you know, it's in this cross-section results, it's very important, and the variables you include are really not sufficient to get rid of the confoundedness. In both types of regression, you can include a lot of variables, but ultimately, you know, the problem of confoundedness remains in this type of regression for both for the you know, the unconditional distribution regressions and also for OLS regression. Interpretations of results as returns to education is not really appropriate. You know, your RIF regression results, they indicate the contribution of each factor to marginal distribution in each equation. For example, if you look at your, for example, the effect of vocational training, what it tells me is that between the first and fifth deciles, it increases inequality, but then on the upper parts of the stream, it reduces inequality. You cannot interpret this as the standard returns to education that we do in OLS regressions. Now, to deal with confoundedness issues and easier interpretation, I think I recommend that you use conditional quantile regression, because that allows you the use of panel data. and then to use the panel data, I mean, your data is supposed to be panel, but probably it's not appropriate. Go back to the ELMPS and use that, because then you have a longer series and more appropriate data. But then use conditional quantile regression. Why do you use unconditional quantile regression if you do not, if your interest is not in earning inequality, because you haven't started with the issue of earnings inequality? Conclusions are sensible, but not directly linked to the results. I think there is a synergy to conclude between the two methods and data used in the two papers. The impact of unionization on inequality in paper 1 can be studied using methods in the second paper. The ELMPS data can allow estimation of panel quantile regression to deal with compoundedness issues in the second paper on the impact of vocational schools schooling on earnings. Thank you very much. I stop here, and I didn't time myself. I hope the 20 minutes is fine. So I think it would be a good idea if the presenters want to come back and address some of these questions, or if you wish, if you prefer, we go into questions and answers, and at the end you answer. Would you like to? Okay.
So I noted most of the comments, and I'm generally agree with what you said. I think that the theoretical background and that how unions function in Egypt is an important piece of information that should be in the article, but it's not that easy to find, and a lot of it is hearsay in a way. You can find in the literature people arguing that the EUTF, for example, doesn't work like a union, it works like an instrument of the regime. I mean, there's no mathematical proof possible to make me show that that's the case. I can only report what some other scholars have said. Regarding independent unions, they're kind of a recent phenomenon in Egypt, at least not older than 2 or 3 decades. And it's impossible to know which unions are independent and which are not, in the ELMPS data at least. I've tried to reach out to an NGO, which is called, not remembering something, Workers' Services. It's an NGO, it's not a proper union, but they follow very closely everything union related in Egypt. I hope maybe they'll get back to me someday with some more information. But I do agree that some more background would be good to feed the article. Absolutely agree on the descriptive statistics. It should definitely be there. In a subsequent version of the paper, I'll add it for all the different specifications. In a way, I think my approach to the paper was, since I don't have a very convincing identification strategy because of the very difficult issue regarding unions and multiple layers of selection, etc. I provide small pieces of evidence, and altogether I try to tell a story from that. So that's also perhaps why the paper is a bit long, but you're right that I mean, even if I do that, I could still very carefully, more carefully perhaps, examine what's going on for each different method. So clearly, I think your comment on heterogeneity versus these different biases that perhaps are more of a credible explanation in other contexts is definitely something that I should dig in a bit deeper. Firm size and the segmentation along public and private companies is definitely relevant. You mentioned the age insignificant. I actually, it's age and age squared in the regression. I only put 1 because otherwise the table would take up too much space. I believe that age squared is perhaps significant. You comment on attrition as well. Indeed, for the panel regression, there's an attrition topic that should be discussed. Haven't done it because, again, these are small bits of information that altogether paint a picture, but I should be more careful with that. What else? Perhaps some briefs on the union presence. that would be a good idea, although since I aggregate, to create this subsample of data, I aggregate information at the sector level. So I only have about 100 or 150 observations per regression here. So I'm thinking of trying to exploit, to estimate different coefficients along the distribution might be asking too much from the data, but it's worth a try, definitely. Yeah, I think that's what I managed to write down. I'm hoping maybe you'd be willing to share your PowerPoint after, and then I can get.
Sure. So I've written detailed comments on your paper. Also, I send you the paper with comments. And,
okay,
yeah,
thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So May and Rania, would you like to give us a few minutes of your response, if you wish?
Let me answer some of these questions, and let Rania respond to some of the others. First of all, yes, you're right. That should be the impact of vocational and not the inequality. The reason for that at the beginning there was actually another component added in the regression, which was the interquartile measurements. So we decided to exclude it, but we didn't change the title. And yes, definitely we need to define the informal urban areas, should be added, as well as the standard errors. We're going to add these to the tables and the summary statistics. And you're absolutely right. We need to cover this as well. And give a brief about the earnings and wages and inequality over time. Regarding the conditional quantile regression, we'll look at it, but the thing is, actually, without using any fixed effect model or anything else, we applied the conditional quantile regression, and the results were very close. I mean, but definitely, in order to correct for the confoundedness, we'll look at it. The thing is that I didn't get very well. Maybe if you can explain it further to me. Regarding it, it's not considered returns to education, because actually it's the marginal effect. Yes, it's marginal effect, but we are comparing the vocational to the below secondary at each quantile. So, which means there is a difference or not, significant difference or not in the wages at this quantile. So maybe you can explain this to me further. And if I may, actually, can I respond to Insan as well, or shall it be later?
Well, if you finish, we can move on to the question. Yeah.
Okay.
Rania, do you
yeah, thanks a lot for your comments. Definitely we'll do a lot of them, as Mai mentioned. Just I want to respond to your suggestion on dropping the gender secondary, or why the gender secondary are small. It's definitely, as you mentioned, that it is because it's not really gender education or gender secondary is not a terminal degree. So people usually go to gender secondary to pursue like university degree. So that's why you find very few who decided to go into general secondary, but just could not really go and continue to university. That's why it was small. And we have been going back and forth on where should we put them. So we did put them with the below secondary, but definitely maybe we should reconsider dropping them. But your suggestion regarding combining informal and formal urban, because of their sample, this is we need to think about that, because the main title of the paper maybe would show the sample statistics, and maybe you could be more convincing about the sample size and still be able to keep them. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. So there is I'll come back to the discussion, but Insan wants to raise a question. Shirin, can you? Okay, how do you get Insan in.
I'm allowing him to talk as we speak.
Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Insan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Insan, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Masood. Thank you, presenters. Bjorn, nice to meet you. Good to see you, May. Good to see you, Rania. I have many questions. Since we're on Rania and May's paper, perhaps I should start there. I think the title is perhaps misleading, as Masood suggested, but if there is emphasis on inequality, you need to worry about composition effects as well as price effects, right? So you are only looking at price effects at various points in the distribution, but we have no idea what the composition of the workforce looks like, you know, in terms of human capital and so on. So how we move on to inequality, I'm not so sure. But I think I sense what you're trying to do. And I mentioned a paper, a really nice paper, which sort of takes the ideas embedded in the Oaxaca blinder decomposition and uses them in the context of quantile regressions. Perhaps that's what you have in mind. I don't know, but it's just a suggestion. So let me stop there and see if you have any reactions to my point. And then I also have some questions to Bjorn. If I have the chance, I'll ask those as well.
Mine.
Okay, no, this is wasn't the main objective of the paper. Actually, is to do inequality decomposition. And what you're saying is that we can compare the two, for instance, two areas and measure the inequality, and the difference in the inequality, we can do the decomposition to the two parts, the composition effect and the price effect. Yeah, that can be done, but this is not wasn't the plan. Yani, this wasn't the plan at this point. And the main actually purpose was, or the main objective was, to measure the effectiveness of vocational secondary vocational education, and compare it in the three areas: urban and rural and informal areas. And this is the reason actually I wanted to come back to this point that was raised by Dr. Masood. When he mentioned that we can combine the informal urban areas with the urban areas. Actually, this was the main core of the paper, is trying to measure the return to education in these areas, because as other papers mentioned, that those who are living there, they are marginalized. And those actually who are in vocational education are marginalized. So what about those who are vocational graduates and living over there? This was the main objective of the paper. But definitely, it's a small sample size. Yes, we agree on that. Another alternative, we can always go with another survey that was done by Population Council as well in the formal areas, but it was done 2 years later, so we won't be able to compare it with rural and urban. So maybe Rania, if you want to add something.
No, you basically mentioned everything. But I would say maybe it could be a good extension of the paper to consider the Oaxaca decomposition with like quantile regression. And Insan, you mentioned like a paper that uses this, and you said right?
Yes, I did. I think I put it in I put the reference in the Q&A. You should be able to recover it.
I wrote it.
Okay. But
it's by May 2005.
Allow me to continue a little bit. You know, I look at the numbers, and my recollection is that the return to vocational and the return to secondary, they're almost the same in various quartiles in urban areas and in also rural areas. Now, for example, think of it this way. Perhaps when people are young, you know, they're in the lower quartile, and there's a certain ordering, you know, secondary school graduates earn more. And then when they get older, get some more experience, they move into the second or the third quartile, you know, things like that. So that's what I mean by composition. So the way you look at the data, I'm not sure exactly what we learn. Okay, you said you're not interested in equality, but in terms of making sense of the premia, what do we learn?
Sorry, can I come in here and just mention something? It was asked by Rania maybe. Can we interpret these as returns to factors? No, we can't actually. And you cannot compare, for example, the rural and urban. This is the effect of a change in a variable on unconditional distribution. Now, the distribution in rural areas is very different from urban areas. It's you know, we cannot compare these two in terms of returns to education. This
that's my point.
And that's what I was making. If you want to come close to that, and actually even conditional quantization doesn't give you returns, but it's closer. So my suggestion was, you know, just use conditional quantize. If you want to investigate distribution of earnings, then as Insan suggests, use these decomposition methods and use unconditional quantize. But I don't know why you use unconditional quantize if you want to just look at the returns to particular factors. That's not really, and you cannot compare across different equations, urban, rural. And the other thing is that, you know, your informal sector, first of all, you have to define it. I don't understand what it is. Secondly, you know, nothing is significant there. And the reason is, you know, the sample is too small, and these methods are not really appropriate for what you're doing. So that's why I made the suggestion. Okay, now, Insan, do you want to ask your question about Bjorn's paper?
Yes, if I could. Yeah, I think it's very nice shift in focus, as Masood suggested. But I'm a little worried about how we make sense of this result. I put several questions in the Q&A, Bjorn. I hope you've had the chance to read them. But basically, what is the framework that drives the positive union differential estimate that you have? You mentioned 2 rounds of selection. Unions decide which sector to operate in because rents may not be evenly distributed across sectors. And secondly, workers, I assume, decide to be union members or not. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know exactly what the institutional setup is. Sometimes things operate differently. So without a good sense of how all these layers of selection work, I don't think we can go very far making sense of it. I mean, you know, one way of looking at it is just to say, okay, this is an authoritarian country, and you know, unions are in cahoots with the regime, and you know, I think you had private sector companies, but you know, they're basically exchanges of favors. That's what we have. Well, if that's the paradigm, perhaps I don't know if there are any backing to it from voting records or any evidence of how unions might try to influence voting behavior of their members. You know, then that would be more of a political economy explanation. But I'm fascinated by the result, and I can tell that you have a long paper and you've only had the chance to talk about tidbits. So I could have a very mistaken impression of it. If that's the case, I apologize. But, you know, basically it's a result begging for explanations, and perhaps you can help us.
Yes, so first, I did see your questions and then the Q&R. I answered, I think, most of them there. So I agree with you again, and I agree with Masood. There is a political economy perspective to it, but getting the data is not very easy, I think. We know from, well, one of the sources is the NGO that I mentioned before, which is, I believe, the Central Union Workers Services. They've detailed widespread fraud for the recent 2018-2022 mandate for trade union elections. Candidates weren't allowed to be, weren't eligible for no apparent reason. In general, voting seemed to be fraudulent. So definitely voting is one way that the state is controlling union operation, whether it's independent or the EUTF. Another way was a law that was passed in 2018 that I didn't have the time to go into, which basically said all independent unions, and there were more than 1,000 unions, have to cease to exist and have to re-register. And they were given a very brief time period to do so. So after the time period ended, only about 100 or 150 of those 1,000 and more unions actually managed to get registered. So in a way, the law, what it actually came down to was get rid of as many independent unions as possible. So yeah, the regime is still trying to control the independent unions. That's a fact, and it's going on right now. So that's kind of the context for the whole thing. Now, your question, the one you alluded to as well here and in the Q&A, was how do we explain this positive wage gap? And to be honest, yes, I haven't pushed the investigations far enough at the moment. The paper isn't finished. There's a whole section I want to write where I would like to make use of this this ban of over 800 unions as an exogenous event to see if that changed something in the sectors that were particularly concerned or not. But I think it's a bit too early to do that now. The 2019 labor force survey is not available yet. Maybe you need to wait an additional couple of years. But in the end, I would like to do something along those lines. And in the meantime, I would just try to dig a bit deeper into the composition of workers who are unionized and not in different wage segments. I mean, the public-private segmentation is one obvious thing to look into. Although I did try, it's not in the paper, to run the regression separately for different institutional categories, so for public and for private, and there's still a positive wage gap for the private sector only and for the public sector only. So I think it's a mix of things that's going on, and it definitely needs more exploration, which I will continue to do with the help of your comments. So thanks for those.
Thanks, Bjorn. Can I come back on this? Because I think your data would allow you to answer some of these questions. You know, let's start with this story. I mean, the government sector in all these economies is the biggest employer. Mm. So these wage agreements that I'm talking about, these are announced probably annual in some countries that I know of. I don't know about Egypt, but you may know more. About the public sector pay scales, both relativities, but also the level, considering, you know, inflation and the effect it would have on the private sector, etc. When I say kind of, you know, tripartite sort of agreement, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's, you know, it is done in a democratic fashion, but the government has to take into account all of these factors. Mm. Both for the levels and relativity. So let's say this is done. And if unions, now, if you look at the union law, let's say it says all the factories above or workshops above 40 workers have to be part of the union, the centralized union, whether private sector or public sector. So the question, first of all, as I said, you have to go and find out, and this is in the law probably. The second thing is this question of segmentation. You just separate all of these small firms, informal sector, which is not part of, I mean, the informality derives some of your answers because you include, you know, the very informal, low pay sectors with large ones. Just remove them and then look at the way the private sector and public sector wages follow each other. What are these circulars that the government every year brings out? If they are imposed, it means that the effect of union is very strong, and actually these relativities will probably disappear, which doesn't mean that the unions are weak. It means that actually union is strong because it imposes the same wage structure on the private sector. So, but a lot of these questions other people cannot answer, but you can answer with your data, because then you can look at, you know, the behavior, the relationship between private, public sector wages, the relationship between the minimum wage and wages in the higher segments. So it's a valuable data that you have, but if you start asking these sort of questions, rather than, you know, okay, it's good to follow the standard models of union behavior, you know, selectivity bias, etc. But these are really related to unions where you have free trade union activity. But for these authoritarian countries, you know, the methods should be different, and you have to look at heterogeneity in a different way rather than selectivity bias. It's heterogeneity bias, and then lack of, you know, when you, yeah, if you find out that, for example, after taking account of heterogeneity, that, you know, there is no differentials, it doesn't necessarily mean that the unions are not strong. It may actually mean that they are strong because they're imposing these wage scales also on the private sector. I think Insan raised his hand. So if, yeah, Insan, could you
yeah, just, you know, one more time. I mean, I think there is a result there, right? I mean, I'm sure Bjorn has done his best to find that positive and statistically significant coefficient. It doesn't go away, you know, whether you do it this way, that way. So the question again is why? I mean, what do unions promise? What do they, what are they in the market for, right? I mean, this is fascinating. I'm really intrigued, and I encourage Bjorn to continue. Thank you.
Okay. Well, any other questions or comments? Okay, Shaukat Hamuda has raised hands, so please.
Yes. And I think Dr. Insan Tonali might have raised hand again. I'm not sure, so I'll allow both of them.
Sorry, I lowered it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Shaukat.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would like to also to have more space for other participants. Seems like the space is now including 2 discussants. I would like the other participants to give their views. My question is, I wrote it in questions and answers, is that in Egypt is a particular country which has been governed by the military regimes for almost 70 years. So only 1 year of democracy. And I am sure this has implications for labor unions. And I would like the author, Dr. Nelson, to include in the review of the literature cases where countries have a military regime like Spain, they have a dictatorship, and then they move to a democracy. How did that affect labor unions? And did the wage gap increase under democracy relative to the military regimes? That's my question. Thank you.
you very much. Okay, I want to come back to this. Insan pointed out that we have this result, but I think this result would be the wage gap may just be removed if we exclude the informal sector or the sector that by definition is not unionized, and just compare the sectors that according to law should be unionized. Well, this is my guess, but I think Bjorn should look at that in terms of including size of the firm or allowing for this sort of labor market segmentation. We get more information on that.
Can I just say one word about that? I'm not as confident as you that it will go away. And that's my fault, perhaps, because I didn't show the descriptive statistics for the PSM, but there's a whole lot of variables in the propensity score matching model, including firm size. And I really remove all of the low probabilities and the high probabilities to have a broad but nice common support. And I still find this is positive coefficient. I mean, it's not experimental evidence. It's a PSM, but I'm not as confident it will completely go away. So I think the mystery is still here, and I'll continue working on it in any way.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to?
No. That's okay. Thank you.
Okay, this has been really excellent session, and I've learned a lot by reading the papers, and I hope we'll get more from the authors on the same issues. And thanks to participants and of course the presenters. So we end this session if there are no more questions. And
yes, we just want to thank you, Dr. Masoud, for a very, very rich discussion and very detailed and thorough discussions, comments. I'm really, really grateful on behalf of all my colleagues. And Huda will be in touch with the authors with your discussions, comments, so that when they're taken on board, they can be submitted for the working paper series. We'd like to encourage also the authors, should they wish to ensure that their research travels further, to consider submitting an article for the forum that would go out together with the working paper to ensure it also advises the policy processes. And with that, I really thank you again for an excellent set of papers, excellent discussions, comments, and a very rich discussion.
Thank you very much,
Dr. Masoud, and thank you, Dr. Tanali, for your valuable comments and your feedback. Many thanks.
Thank you. Have a great evening, all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.